Welcome to Thoughts and Theories. There's a strange and heavy feeling that follows us when we've done something wrong. It's not something you can see or touch, but it sits there quietly, deep inside the chest. Guilt. Every human being, no matter how rational or modern, knows this feeling, and somewhere, hidden behind it, is a longing, not just to be forgiven, but to be redeemed, to somehow make things right again. No writer explored this more deeply than Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wasn't just a novelist, he was a psychologist of the soul long before psychology existed. His stories tear open the human heart to show what happens when a person struggles with guilt, when they crave freedom but cannot escape the weight of their own conscience. Dostoevsky lived what he wrote. In his 20s, he was a radical idealist. He joined a small group that discussed political reform in Russia. But when the government found out, he was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to death. On the morning of his execution, he stood in front of a firing squad. The guns were raised. He waited for the command. And just before the shots were fired, a messenger arrived with news. The Tsar had granted a last-minute pardon. His death sentence was changed to years of hard labor in Siberia. That moment changed Dostoevsky forever. Imagine standing face to face with your own death, only to be given life back at the last second. What would that do to your understanding of guilt, of forgiveness, of the value of being alive? For Dostoevsky, it shattered everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. It showed him that human beings are not simple creatures of reason or morality. They are torn between light and darkness, between sin and the desperate hope for redemption. In his novel, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky gives us Raskolnikov, a young student who believes that great men have the right to commit crimes if it serves a higher purpose. He kills an old pawnbroker just to test this idea. He believes he's above morality. But instead of freedom, he finds himself drowning in guilt. The more he tries to justify his actions, the heavier his conscience becomes. He can't sleep. He becomes paranoid, angry, and isolated. His crime doesn't free him, it traps him. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky shows that guilt isn't just a feeling. It's the soul's way of demanding truth. You can argue all you want that morality is subjective, or that justice is a social construct. But when you hurt someone, your own mind turns against you. You can't silence it. No philosophy or logic can make it disappear. That's why guilt is universal. It doesn't depend on religion or belief in God. It's a human experience that exposes the part of us we can't control. Dostoevsky believed that redemption begins when a person stops running from this guilt, when they face it fully, with honesty, even if it breaks them. Raskolnikov finally confesses, not because he fears punishment, but because he realizes that truth itself is a kind of freedom. The act of confession restores his humanity. For Dostoevsky, redemption doesn't mean escaping justice. It means confronting who you really are. This idea might sound religious, but it's actually psychological and deeply human. We see it everywhere. When someone lies or cheats, they might justify it at first. But over time, the weight of that lie eats away at them. They might get angry, avoid people, or bury themselves in distractions. Yet, something inside keeps pushing them toward honesty. That inner push is the beginning of redemption. In another of his novels, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky explores guilt and redemption not through crime, but through love and responsibility. The brothers represent different sides of human nature: reason, passion, and faith. One of them, Ivan, is an intellectual who argues that if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. It's a powerful idea, but Dostoevsky doesn't answer it with theology. He answers it with emotion. Ivan's philosophy destroys him, not because it's logically wrong, but because it denies the moral reality that lives inside the human heart. He tries to live without guilt, without moral limits, but ends up consumed by madness and despair. What Dostoevsky was really asking is this: can a person live without some sense of moral accountability? Can we survive if we silence that inner voice that tells us we've done wrong? His novels suggest that we can't. When people try to become their own gods, deciding what's right and wrong purely for themselves, they lose something essential. They lose the ability to love, to forgive, to connect. We can see this in modern life, too. People today often talk about living authentically, following their desires, doing whatever feels right. But without reflection, that freedom easily turns into chaos. We see it in broken relationships, in addiction, in the endless search for meaning. Guilt, unpleasant as it is, might be the only thing that reminds us of the difference between freedom and destruction. Dostoevsky's own life was full of guilt. He struggled with gambling addiction. He lost his money, hurt his wife, and felt shame for his weakness. But he never hid from it. Instead, he turned his failures into insight. He once wrote that to be too aware is a sickness, a kind of spiritual disease. He meant that when a person becomes conscious of their own darkness, life becomes painful. Yet that pain, he believed, is what leads to compassion. When you suffer for your own faults, you learn to forgive others. This is where Dostoevsky's idea of redemption becomes truly profound. Redemption isn't something that comes from a priest or a ritual. It's an inner transformation, a shift from pride to humility, from self-justification to self-understanding. It doesn't erase guilt, but gives it meaning. The pain becomes a lesson. The guilt becomes a bridge between who you were and who you can become. We see this not just in his fiction, but in everyday life. Think of someone who's made a serious mistake, hurt someone deeply, betrayed a friend, or acted selfishly. At first, they might deny it. Then they might feel crushed by shame. But if they face it honestly and change, that very guilt becomes a source of strength. It softens them. They become kinder, more empathetic. They've redeemed themselves not by escaping punishment, but by becoming more human. Dostoevsky believed that every person carries within them both the criminal and the saint. The line between good and evil doesn't run between nations or classes. It runs through every human heart. That's what makes his work so timeless. He doesn't divide people into heroes and villains. He shows that the potential for both guilt and redemption exists in all of us. It's easy to read Dostoevsky and think his message is purely religious, but even if you remove all talk of God, his insight remains. Because whether or not there's divine forgiveness, humans still crave reconciliation. We still need to make peace with ourselves and with others. When we betray, lie, or harm, we fracture something within. And when we make amends, when we tell the truth, when we take responsibility, we repair that fracture. That's redemption, not in a spiritual sense, but in a deeply human one. At its core, Dostoevsky's philosophy is about facing reality. We live in an age where we avoid pain at all costs. We distract ourselves endlessly to escape discomfort. But Dostoevsky insists that only through pain and confrontation with guilt do we grow. He once wrote that suffering is the origin of consciousness. Without it, we remain shallow. Pain forces us to see what we are capable of, both the good and the terrible. In that sense, guilt is not our enemy. It's the beginning of wisdom. It points to the parts of ourselves that need healing. It asks us to stop pretending. It tells us that our actions matter, not just to society, but to our own souls. And redemption isn't about erasing what we've done. It's about transforming it into something meaningful. Maybe that's why Dostoevsky's work still resonates today, even in a world that doesn't talk much about sin or salvation. We still understand guilt. We still long for forgiveness. We still want to believe that no matter how far we fall, there's a way back. At the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov kneels beside the woman who loves him, realizing for the first time that redemption doesn't come from logic, but from love. The kind that accepts you as you are, even when you've failed. And that might be Dostoevsky's most important lesson. Guilt isolates us, but redemption reconnects us to truth, to others, and to ourselves. In the end, Dostoevsky shows that the human soul lives in tension between guilt and redemption, between destruction and rebirth. We are not perfect creatures, but we are capable of change. We can face our darkness and still choose the light. And maybe that's what makes life worth living. Not being free from guilt, but learning how to turn it into compassion, humility, and understanding. That is the journey Dostoevsky invites us to take. The journey through guilt, toward redemption, and ultimately toward being human.